Okay, I'm Professor Mike Sachs, and I'm actually chairing this session on professions and responsible leadership. And I'd like to sort of welcome you to this debate. It has proved to be extraordinarily popular amongst those who are acting as an audience, and will also have access to the Q&A tab during the session. And this is part of a series, really, in conjunction with both UNITAR and with the Institute for Responsible Leadership, which I chair. And I'm particularly looking forward to being involved in this discussion because basically this is a very strong interest of mine. I've published a lot of books on this subject, and I've regularly advised governments and professions themselves on this issue as well. And so I'm really excited about it, and I think it should be really fascinating. I think that just in terms of a background, very briefly, we live in a world where in the past, professions were regarded absolutely, almost without question, as responsible leaders. And this didn't matter whether people are accountants or doctors or lawyers or teachers in modern societies. They were actually, because of their long training, because of their qualifications, their ethical codes, they were generally put on a pedestal and regarded as responsible leaders. And I think that in this kind of context, we have in the last sort of few decades seen some more critical thought about professions and where they're going. And they have been challenged in a variety of ways, from users of services, from the state itself, and also from the growing power of corporations on an international plane. And the rise of professional service firms has added very much to the party in terms of creating, greater complexity around what professions are doing, who they're serving. Do they serve the public? In its most generic sense, particularly in the UN context around the Sustainable Development Goals, or are they self-serving, or are they serving some other kind of party in society? And I think that today I'm really pleased to be able to introduce colleagues of mine from the editorial board of the Journal of Professions and Organization. And it's really a delight, because they are probably the most eminent people globally in terms of talking about this subject. And it is a top journal, and I'm delighted to be involved myself as an associate editor. But I would like to start very much with an introduction by Alex Meyer, who's a very good friend of mine, but also has the role of director of the People and Social Inclusion, the Division of People and Social Inclusion at UNITAR. And also, in addition to this, runs and oversees the CFAL centres across the globe. So we're delighted to have you with us, Alex, and thanks so much for giving an introduction from Qatar, where you are currently. So thank you, and we look forward to this.
Thanks to you, Mike. I hope you can hear me well. Indeed, I send you warm greetings from Doha, where we are doing what we do for a living, which is to try and build capacity to offer training, in this case, for parliamentarians. So thank you for giving me this great opportunity to share just for a few minutes why we at the United Nations, and particularly at UNITAR, the UN agency that I represent, why we believe that a dialogue and analysis of professions and responsible leadership is actually important. So let me begin by saying that this topic has a rather pivotal role for society as a whole. I think that many people, of course, want to develop a professional career. Many people, of course, grow in their professional career. But because of the pressure of professional careers, we tend to lose perspective at a point in time. And this should serve perhaps with so many distinguished panelists here to help us to understand that the role that each one of us play has to be within our professions, has to be understood under the prism and the magnifying glass of responsible leadership. So embodying values as excellence, as ethics-based decision-making as a whole, commitment to lifelong learning, and above anything and everything, having this impetus and understanding on why we are responsible for the improvement of our societies is rather a top priority, has to be a top priority. So we know that as professionals, we hold a unique position of influence within our respective fields. Our decisions and actions can have far-reaching consequences, impacting not only individuals, but entire communities and ecosystems. Therefore, we believe that we must embrace the principles of responsible leadership. You are going to hear distinguished participants, foremost experts on what is it that we are really talking about when it comes to responsible leadership. Now, what is it? From our perspective at the United Nations, it goes beyond simply making decisions. It entails making ethical choices that consider the broader implications for society and the environment. Responsible leaders strive to balance the needs of various stakeholders while upholding integrity, transparency, and honor. From a personal perspective, I understand the challenges that professionals face in fulfilling their roles, whether it is navigating complex decisions or grappling with ever-changing environments. The path to effective leadership is fraught with obstacles and challenges. We all live through that, we all know that. Yet, within these challenges lie opportunities for innovation, collaboration, and positive change. It is indeed essential, we believe, to recognize that responsibility does not rest solely on the shoulders of individuals. It extends to organizations and institutions as well. As leaders, we must foster environments that cultivate a sense of community, shared values, integrity, and accountability. Only then can we create workplaces where individuals succeed and contribute to meaningful change. Personally and professionally, then, we have the duty to collaborate and grow, creating safe and supportive environments for our teams to flourish. So going back to what I was saying at the beginning, in representing UNITAR and the United Nations in this important dialogue, let me also try and put this topic of today under the prism and under the perspective of the Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development that we have been pushing since January of 2016. Professor Sachs, our good friend Mike Sachs, knows wholeheartedly that when we talk about a better world, when we talk about progress in a sustainable manner, when we talk about the Sustainable Development Goals, we also talk about the individual role that each one of us will have. And in this individual role, it's very important as professionals, as individuals again, to understand that we are responsible not only to ourselves, to our families, to our communities, but to society as a whole. So I would like to invite everyone listening in giving these welcoming remarks to think about the bigger picture, what you can achieve when you develop your professions with these values of professionalism that understands responsible leadership. And I conclude by inviting all of you to also be an agent of change and to help us achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. You can make a difference. And you professionals listening from many countries around the world, if you embrace responsible leadership, as I try to do in the day-to-day, in every interaction that I have, I assure you that this world of ours will be better. With that, dear Mike, thank you again for giving me this opportunity. Back to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex. They're really wise words, and I think that one of the things that I would take from your introduction is the fact that professions, however you put it, are really critical in our current society. And so this is a very timely debate, I think, that we're having today under the auspices of UNITAR and the IRL. And I think without further ado, I would move on to introduce our keynote speaker, who is Professor Daniel Muzio, who is Professor of Management at the University of York. And he actually has mainstream interests in the organization and management of professions, which is very apposite, and indeed professional service firms. We have actually co-authored a book on professions and professional service firms, but particularly focuses at the current time on issues of professional wrongdoing and diversity, inclusion, and equal opportunity, which are very resonant with the goals of the UN, and particularly the latter aspects. And he is currently not only widely published, but he is the general editor of Management Studies and a founding editor of the Journal of Professions and Organisation. But he's previously worked at a whole range of top UK universities and has held visiting positions at the University of Oxford, the Cass Business School in the UK, and Luis Guido Carli at the University of Rome in Italy. So he's fairly widely flung, I think, Daniel, that would be fair to say. And we look forward very much to your presentation.
Thank you, Mike, for the introduction. I'm delighted to be invited and to have this opportunity to speak to you. So thanks to UNITAR and to IRL. Yes, I can see my slides. What I wanted to do today, in my 25 minutes of fame, I wanted to retell the history of some of the largest corporate scandals of the last 20, 30 years through the lens of the involvement that the professions have had in these. Now, these events will be known to you, but I want to perhaps show a different side of the story, which is very important. These events, you will agree, are very significant in terms of the material consequences, but also of the erosion in trust in key societal institutions that they've caused. Institutions like capitalism, democracy, even science itself. And therefore they still reverberate in today's troubled world. Now, these events, and I will give you examples very soon, speak to the failure in ethical leadership of our corporate elites and policy-making elites. But my argument is also they speak to the failure of the professions. Now, this is fundamental because without the professions, we would live in a worse world. And we need the professions if we stand a chance to address the grand challenges that face humanity, including the United Nations Sustainability Goals. So this is really a call for the professions to rediscover their moral leadership and their moral authority. So this is really to set up my talk. So if we move to the next slide, please. So I want you, as we move to the next slide, I want you to think about events which happened 20, 30 years ago. Sarah, next slide, please. And in particular, I want you to think about the events of Parmalat and Enron. So when Parmalat went bust in the 23rd of December 2003 with a whole of 14 billion euro in debts, which was double its annual turnover, this was a result of a systematic and prolonged instance of fraud. Its accounts had been falsified for the 14 years in which Parmalat had been listed on the Milan Stock Exchange. Now, this was only possible because a number of professions who were involved in running and in advising Parmalat had failed to see or chosen not to see the misconduct being perpetrated. So Deloitte, which was Parmalat's auditor, signed the accounts of Parmalat without raising any doubts until the very end, October 2003, 2 months before the bankruptcy, when it issued a disclaimer that it couldn't verify the accounts of a subsidiary of Parmalat, which was where the problems were. Similarly, if we look at security analysts like Standard & Poor's, they'd given a positive positive endorsement of Parmalat's debt right until the very end, right until December 2023. The same applies to equity analysts. Out of 65 equity analysts, 55 had issued strong buy or buy recommendations until the very, very end. It's the same story at Enron, although this happened in perhaps, allegedly the most sophisticated US capital market system. Again, scores of professionals who were there to make sure that things like this didn't happen, either failed or to see, or chose not to see, or were directly involved in the focal events. If we can have the next slide, please.
Sarah, could we move the slide on, please?
Yes, not only the next one, actually, it's the one after, please.
Yeah.
If we can move 2 slides. So these events are, I guess, well known to all of you, which caused thousands of redundancies, hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands of redundancies, which led to significant economic damage in terms of lost pensions, which destabilized entire community. I'm thinking of Enron's role in the American energy crisis or the Californian energy crisis. In terms of Parmalat, I'm thinking about the collapse in public pride in the old city of Parma, which was structured around Parmalat, lead us to a very important question, which obviously is fundamental for today. Where were the professionals? Where were the professionals that were tasked to make sure that events like these do not happen? We would need slide 4 if possible, but I sense that there is a problem with the slides. This is a very important question, not only from a practical point of view, but also from a theoretical point of view. Professions, compared to other occupations, enjoy some significant privileges in today's economy. They often have monopolies, they have reserved areas of practice, they have reserved titles. And this translates into higher levels of financial and symbolic rewards compared to other occupations. The idea is that they enjoy these rewards, they're granted these rewards because they have an ethical foundation and they act in the public interest. Yes, slide before, please. 4. Way, excellent. So they act in the public interest, and various scholars from various different theoretical positions have commented on this. They have fiduciary duties. The responsibility of the professions is to prioritize the interests of the clients and indeed of society over their own economic self-interest. They are social trustees of fundamental skills which are essential for individual and societal well-being. Andy Abbott once quoted, "Professions measure our profit, heal our bodies, and save our souls." That really speaks to the essential importance of the skills that professions control. They are gatekeepers to fundamental institutions. So they act in a quasi-regulatory role, making things like pension systems, capital markets, the administration of justice possible. So the idea is that there's a regulative bargain whereby the state protects the professions with restrictive arrangements, monopolies, and so on, in exchange for the promise of the profession to focus on the quality of its service and to act in the public interest. Now, we could argue that that regulative bargain has been breached by events such as the ones which I've described before. So if we move to the next slide, please, slide 5. So this leads to the question, why? Why is this happening? Why do we have failure? Why do we have a collapse in the regulatory role of the profession? Now, if you look at established bodies of knowledge, we find partial answers. There are probably 2 schools of thought in the study of professions. There's a functionalist perspective, which views professions as virtuous entities. And therefore, if misconduct occurs, it's the fault of a few rogue individuals, a few bad apples who we've let in and who inadvertently have polluted the system of the professions and are leading to all the problems. If we can have slide 6 for a minute, please. I want you to meet a few of the bad apples on slide 6. Now, on the left, Mike is smiling. I guess he recognizes Dr. Harold Shipman, or Dr. Death, probably the biggest serial killer in British history, trialed for the murder of 15 people, but possibly responsible for the murder of hundreds of people, particularly elderly patients. Some of them, I think it was for financial benefit, but I think most of it was because he didn't like the old people very much. So clearly an example of a bad apple. On the right, Nick Leeson, Barings Bank took a few unauthorized investment decisions, which didn't pay. So he falsified accounts to hide them and to continue investing money on the client behalf against the knowledge and wishes of the client, and led ultimately to the collapse of Barings Bank, which was the oldest British investment bank at the time. So from a functionalist perspective, it's the responsibility of a few rotten individuals. The point is to stop them joining, to tougher exams, to have surveillance in place, and to discipline them when they are caught. If we go back to slide 5, please. There is also a more dominant theory from the 60s and 70s. We could call it occupational dominance, but it would also have different names, which actually borrows on George Bernard Shaw's original adage that professions are a conspiracy against lying. Middle class, trade unions for middle class occupations. The essence of a profession is to prioritize and maximize the interests of its members vis-a-vis everybody else. Surely, if they can do this and serve the public good, all the better. But the purpose of the profession is to create advantage, create occupational dominance for its members. And in this context, all the kind of promises and the ethical statements are smoke screens of hypocrisy to make things like monopoly, self-interest more palatable. So it's a bad barrel thesis. Now, both of these capture part of the problem, offer a possible answer, but it's very black and white, it's very partial, and it's also not very dynamic. Professions are inherently good or inherently bad. It doesn't really deal with change over time, and why these cases of professional misconduct seem to be accelerating recently. So if we have slide 7, please. So what I want to propose here, drawing on the work of others, including Andy Abbott and others as well, is a boundary perspective, a kind of a bad seller hypothesis, let's call it. And the idea here is that misconduct emerges from the changing relationships between actors in a broader professional ecology, in a broader professional net, which comprises of various professions competing with each other, but also the stakeholders, clients, the state, investors, regulators. And what is the flashpoint here? The flashpoint are boundaries. Boundaries are zones of conflict, because professions compete with each other, they skirmish with each other to control work, to control tasks. Think of the conflict between lawyers and auditors and accountants over tax advice. Who controls tax work? Because work creates benefits, economical and symbolic. So professions skirmish with each other. They also skirmish with other actors, such as their employers, for instance, over the control of work and the benefits that flow from that work. So what is essential here is how professional boundaries are designed, maintained, and managed. My argument is that these were relatively stable for decades, but today they're increasingly in flux because of things like deregulation. The state is weakening monopolies and restrictive arrangements and encouraging professions to compete with each other in order to have more competition. Globalization, professions are crossing boundaries, and we have competition between professions from different countries. AI and technology, which is leading again to new entrants, which are unsettling established boundaries and divisions of labor. So it's a world in flux. Boundaries are in flux. They're becoming weaker, they're moving, they're changing. I want to move to slide 8, please. Now, why do they matter? Why do they matter? Why do boundaries matter in this context? There are 3 analytical reasons why boundaries are important and why they link to misconduct and to the loss of ethical leadership. One of them is that boundaries can be too weak. They can fail to separate things that should be kept apart, leading to conflict of interests or to various forms of capture. Conflict of interest, think of the auditing and consultancy combination. This was very prominent in the early noughties, and it's one of the dynamics behind Parmalat, Enron, and many of the other scandals which I haven't mentioned. Auditing is a loss, well, profits in auditing are often under attack. It's a commodity service. It's also a service which the client is reluctant to pay for because it's a compliance service. It's a legal requirement which is designed for the benefit of society, not of the client. It's a sign to investors, to employers, to trading parties that the company is safe and its accounts are fair representations of the company's affairs. So clients often resent paying a lot for auditing, but clients love consultancy. Consultancy is viewed as value-adding, solves and addresses problems, it improves things. So the idea is to treat auditing as a loss leader, to discount it, in order to cross-sell consultancy services. Here is your auditing report. By the way, we have identified these problems, and guess what? We can help you to address them by referring you to our consultancy department. What's the risk there? The risk there is that discounting auditing, less attention is given to it. It's downgraded as a public safeguard service in order not to antagonize a client to whom you're hoping to sell lucrative consultancy services. There are other forms, other examples, but this is the prominent one. The other one is to do with a boundary between different stakeholders. Professions have fiduciary responsibilities. They are ultimately, they have to prioritize the interests of the client over their own, but ultimately it goes beyond that. Professionals usually have to act in a public service. Their ultimate client is society rather than the fee-paying client. This is the case of auditing. It's the case of the legal profession, where ultimately lawyers are there to serve the administration of justice. So we have a range of boundaries which are in place to make sure that the professional doesn't exploit the client, but also that the client, especially when we have large multinational clients, does not capture the profession and turn the profession from a servant of the public interest into an instrument, into a hired gun to sustain the client's commercial interests, whatever these are. And again, we have evidence that these boundaries separating professions from other stakeholders are becoming weaker. Enron, Parmalat, and many of those cases all speak to these dynamics of client capture. Professionals which weaken the regulatory stance, weaken the public interest stance, because they're captured by a powerful client on which they depend financially. We have more and more examples of these now. Increasingly, professionals are raising capital from outsiders, and therefore they become responsible to investors. And they become under obligations of showing short-term profitability, even at the expense of the long-term obligations. But the best example, if we can move on slide 9, I realized this very recently. I've been working on this for a while, but I realized that there is another core relationship: professions and their suppliers. This is the poster from the Netflix Painkillers, which talks about one of the true scandals of the last few decades, the American opioid crisis, which has cost hundreds of thousands of lives, not millions perhaps, has destabilized entire health systems, and has led, in my view, one of the many reasons is for the weakening of the boundary between professions and suppliers, particularly doctors and chemists prescribing medicines, opioids, not on the basis of its health benefits, but because they were pressurized and coerced or persuaded by a powerful supplier, in this case, the manufacturers of these medicines, which use all tricks in a book, ranging from old-fashioned bribes to the lure of scantily clad sales forces, in order to get doctors, to capture doctors and chemists, and to get them to act against the public interest in this case. So if we move on to slide 10, so these are examples of professional boundaries being too weak and the risks that flow from this. There is another risk, of course, that boundaries are too strong. They stop us from seeing what happens on the other side. In that context, mistakes, but also misconduct, deliberate examples of misconduct, go unchecked. They become reproduced and magnified in the system. What's striking of the cases of misconduct I've been talking about is that they've lasted for decades, they've been consistent, and nobody has ever checked or stopped. Even when information was there, trials have demonstrated that all the pieces was there, but nobody has seen those. The reason is because the boundaries between professions, whether different types of professions or whether professions in different countries, have prohibited people from seeing what happens on the other side. In this context, professionals have suspended the critical judgment, and they've tended to accept inputs from others in what are multinational and multidisciplinary chains of expertise as good, unquestionably, suspending the skepticism. You can see again this dynamic in Parmalat, in Enron. You can see, for instance, the case of analysts relying faithfully on auditing reports and therefore issuing buy recommendations for shares because of the audit on the basis of flawed reports when the information was actually available for all to see. The collapse of Parmalat, the issue was that Parmalat was audited by Deloitte, but Parmalat's French subsidiary, Bonlat, was audited by Grant Thornton. And the mistakes and the fraud were in the Grant Thornton audited reports of Bonlat. But Deloitte treated these inputs unquestionably, and therefore suspended its judgment whilst accepting reports produced by others downward in the division of labor. Another example is auditors and lawyers. Arthur Anderson did not question some of the shenanigans going on at Enron, in particular the use of off-balance sheet vehicles, because the law firm allegedly had said that these were fair and proper, when there was a lot to be suspicious about. So boundaries are too strong, they hinder collaboration, they lead to a suspension of skepticism and to a blind acceptance of previous inputs in what are increasingly complex, long professional chains of expertise. Slide 11, please. The third analytical issue is that boundaries can be uncertain. They cast areas of shadow. They create liminal spaces. They create confusion and uncertainty. They limit the reach of regulators, and they open up opportunities for experimentation, entrepreneurship, and even old-fashioned misconduct. So, for instance, in a global world where boundaries are uncertain, we have the issue of double or multiple deontology. Which rules apply? And of course, in this context of uncertainty, the risk of ethical mishap or mistakes increases. So if you take the example of offshoring, professional firms offshore professional work to third-party jurisdictions, which are cheaper, like India, for instance. Which standards apply? Those of the home country of the professional firm, those of the country where the work has been offshored, or those of the clients? Or if you take a situation of, I don't know, an American lawyer working in in the Brussels office of a British law firm, dealing with a German client, with a Italian counterpart, again, what ethical standards apply that? There's a confusion of the proliferation of rules and regulators, which leads to unwitting mistakes often. More agentically, professionals also exploit differences in boundaries to the clients or to their own advantage. If we move to slide 12, you don't need an introduction of the Panama Papers, I would imagine. This is an example of there's a whole global industry of professionals which are dedicated to help corporations and wealthy clients who, I was going to say avoid, but let's use the word elude, tax elusion, to minimize the tax obligations. And this is done through the manipulation of boundaries, jurisdictional boundaries between different countries, and the ability of professionals to transcend these. But a more interesting case is probably the case of Lehman Brothers, and which obviously led to the financial crisis. Here, we have an example of what I call jurisdictional shopping. Your client wants to do something, that thing is not allowed in their own home jurisdiction, you go elsewhere to find a jurisdiction that allows it. So in this case, Lehman Brothers wanted to use an accountancy vehicle, Repo 105, to move some of its liabilities off sheet. And that was not allowed in New York. So it found a positive legal opinion in London, where this would have been allowed, to support its actions. And the consequences, of course, are what we all know, the eventual demise of Lehman Brothers triggering the financial crisis. So if we move to slide 13, what I hope I've done here, I've retold you some of the core scandals of the last 20 years, and gosh, there's quite a few of those. But as you can see, all of these have involved the passive or active involvement of professionals. Professionals that were there to make sure that things like this didn't happen, either failed in the duty or actively contributed to the scandals, to the wrongdoing in question. This, I've connected this to the transformation of key institutions and relationships, and in particular to the key role of boundaries in these. The key point is that it's essential how professional boundaries are designed and managed in order to prevent events like this. And obviously, in my view, professional misconduct is one of the key challenges affecting the future of professions. We have had, obviously, an erosion of trust in capitalism, democracy, in science, but also in the work of professionals themselves. And this is at the time, if we move to slide 14, when we need our professional advisors the most. We need professionals to recover the moral and ethical authority and leadership because of the reasons I said before. I cannot imagine how we can solve any of the grand challenges without accessing the expertise of our professional advisors. So moving on to a more, so this is the kind of problem, and I hope I've given you a diagnosis. I've given you a statement of the problem. I've given you a reason why I think the problem occurs, which is to do with boundaries. Now we move into the hardest bit, which is solutions, but I hope that the panel will help me with this in their own interventions. But obviously, what can we take away from this? There needs to be more attention to how boundaries are designed and managed. And sometimes boundaries are too weak. There are certain things that need to be kept apart to avoid capture, conflict of interest, and so on. But then sometimes the problem is the opposite one. Boundaries are too strong. They prevent collaboration. So we need boundaries to be weaker in order for professions to work with each other, to see what goes on the other side. So we need a configuration approach where some things are kept aside, but some things are brought together. Professional work has become multidisciplinary and multinational. Regulation hasn't. Still operates in silos. So we need some way of scaling up regulation so that it works across disciplinary areas and across countries. And finally, perhaps most obviously and most importantly, we need ethical leadership in the professions to reassert the public interest function of the professions. Thank you for the attention.
Daniel, thank you so much for that excellent presentation. I think not only in terms of the content, but you were pitch perfect in terms of timing. So that's brilliant. What I really liked about it was that we can get immersed in this debate about are professions a good thing or a bad thing for society in terms of the way they operate. But you actually have given quite a consummate analysis of some of the structural issues which create the situation for the bad apples or not in the barrel, and I think that is very smart. And so thank you very much for your wonderful presentation to set us off and to set us thinking about wider issues to do with the professions. I'd like very much now to turn to the first of our panelists who may also have comments on your presentation, as well as having, of course, views of their own in terms of moving forward. Now, this is Professor David Brock, who is from the Department of Business Administration at Ben Gurion University of the Negev in Israel. He travels a lot, and he has a number of visiting appointments, visiting roles elsewhere, including at the University of Pretoria in South Africa and the University of New South Wales in Australia. And actually, Australia is where he is currently. And so we really welcome you, David, particularly since you're burning the midnight oil down under there. And so it's really kind of you to come along. And we're really appreciative because it's not just the time zones, but it's the fact that David is actually the editor-in-chief, the head honcho of the Journal of Professions and Organizations. So it's wonderful to have you here. But in addition to this, he also is on the editorial board of the Journal of International Management and also the Journal of Management Studies. So he's quite a busy person, and like everyone else here on the panel, and our keynote speaker is very well published on the professions. And I'm really interested, David, whether you have a little bit more of a conciliatory role in terms of the professions and where we're going. Because I think Daniel has pointed to a more positive future in terms of the steps we may take. Where do you think we are now, David, in terms of the professions and their level of responsible leadership?
Thanks so much, Mike. Yes, it's coming up to midnight here in Sydney, Australia. So, Mike, how much time do I have? You're on mute.
10 minutes.
10 minutes. Okay.
Yeah.
Very good. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Yeah. Thanks.
Yes. So, thanks, Mike, and it's great to be in this amazing forum. Credit to you, Mike, and along with friends and fellow leaders of the Journal of Professions and Organization. And so I feel very much at home, even though it's my first time on a UNITAR forum. And so yes, so hearing Daniel speak about there are bad apples and there are bad barrels, and I would like to very much concur with Daniel's conclusions, his list of solutions, and just sort of have with one foot really on that sort of point where Daniel left us, and I want to put another foot on sort of just the basis of what the professions are about, to sort of take a larger view of things, and then speak perhaps about a way forward. Sarah, if you can show my slides, it would be very nice. Thank you. So right, so and so we can move to the next one. Thank you. So so let's just ask some basic questions and to kind of remind ourselves of what we're talking about. That we're talking about these institutions where you have individuals who accept ethical standards, acquire a set of knowledge and skills, usually with some regulatory oversight of their standards and their skills. Seeing that I'm in Australia, I thought I would use the definition of their Council of Professions. And yes, the professions have codes of conduct. And yes, even though, as Daniel points out, that we do have, let's say, examples of bad apples, we do have examples of bad barrels. I think we still have to accept that the overall institutions, the overall examples that we have of professions, the overall professions that we see in action are very much fundamental to our contemporary societies. Not only the civil, for the civil societies, law and order, healthcare, etc., but also to our contemporary knowledge-intensive societies, the sciences, and the world of high tech. So there's extremely important set of institutions, extremely important set of actors that we have over here. So I thought we could look at them sort of in that from that broad perspective, and then when one dig down a little bit, and then perhaps see a way forward towards the solutions to which Daniel was alluding. Next slide, please, Sarah. So we ask ourselves, what are the fundamental pillars of the professions? And so you see on the slide, there's these four bullets, which I think will be perhaps obvious and perhaps clear and basic to all of us. But I thought just by looking at the four of them in some kind of a sequence, we can sort of see sort of a way forward where the first, for instance, the first one, we talk about a profession as being having specialized knowledge and skills. It's the most basic idea of a profession, very, very fundamental. Not going to we're not going to argue much about that area, and I don't think any major solutions to the world's problems are going to be based on acknowledging the fact that professions are people that have studied a certain amount of years, either in law school or in medical school or in some other educational program, and they can perform various things. The second point, though, we started to talk about the fact that, and again, that we saw in the definitions of professions, that traditionally, and professions have been around for hundreds of years, they have their systems of ethics, they have a level of trustworthiness. Yes, as Daniel reminded us, there are many cases of bad apples and bad barrels, but generally speaking, people trust their doctors and lawyers. We consult with them when we need them. Perhaps our generation is less trusting than previous generations. Perhaps we do ask for second opinions, perhaps third opinions, but society in general does show a level of trustworthiness to these professions. Now to the next 2 points, which sort of are perhaps less obvious and take us a little bit forward to what professions and professionalism was supposed to be about, and perhaps the few that we've forgotten a little about, and that is the idea of collegiality. All of us, whichever profession we're in, whether it's universities or elsewhere, I think sometimes we might ask ourselves, gee, what happened to the collegiality that was supposed to be around here? So perhaps as we go, to these last 2 points on this list, we should be asking ourselves, what can we do to strengthen and remind people that it is really supposed to be a fundamental principle of profession that we are, that we trust each other, that we respect each other, that we're open to learn from each other. There's a kind of altruism, that we do pro bono work, that and this collegiality and altruism and trust and respect can also shore up and strengthen the other basic ideas of trust, of ethics and trustworthiness, and overall, strengthen the effectiveness and efficiency of professions, and move us forward to a better society. So I kind of encourage each one of us, and I remember some years ago sending an email to the rector of a certain university I'm involved with, and saying, isn't this supposed to be a collegial system? Why do we have committees that are, dominated by strong personalities? Remember, we're supposed to be collegial. We're supposed to have time and respect and for each other's points of view. So perhaps we as professionals need to be reminded of this, and perhaps those of us who are leaders and editors in this field need to also remind others of this perhaps somewhat forgotten but important fundamental of professionalism. And the final point is partnership and sharing. Again, aspects of professionalism that have somewhat been forgotten, somewhat neglected these days. And again, like the collegiality and altruism, I would say and hope and perhaps plead that we should, reinvigorate and remind and encourage our fellow professionals and other professionals and to remember these fundamentals. And again, they are part of what professionals, they're part of the way that professionals should be acting, and contribute to the overall status and the overall stature and thus the effectiveness of professions to be the ethical leaders and setters of standards, etc. I just want to conclude with some work that was published in our journal, and here just when I write to further reading, I'm kind of saying to Mike that it's almost my 10 minutes is almost up, but I hope that we can revisit this perhaps in a future UNITAR seminar. And you'll see there's some articles here, some of which Tracy was involved with, and one of the one which you were involved with, Mike, on connective professionalism, where we recognize that we have to think a lot more about how professionals relate to others outside their professions. That is the relational issues, the glue that holds institutions together, that includes the things that are important in our professions. Yes, the knowledge, yes, the skills, also the ethics, also the partnership, the trust, and then our ability to relate to others. So as I see my 10 minutes is just more or less up now, leave with these ideas that we should be heading towards building on what professions were supposed to be, and perhaps this idea of connective professionalism will take us forward strengthening both professionalism, and also contributing to the societies in which we're living. Thank you very much.
David, thank you. That was a really fascinating presentation and leading to a sort of very positive note. I mean, I think one of the messages is more of us should pay even more attention to the many excellent articles we have published in the Journal of Professions and Organisation, because, you know, it has been a real eye-opener, and we cover everything from health through to law, through to accountancy, and so on. And these are really, you know, hot papers that we're dealing with, and we're very pleased to welcome contributions and so on. So, but I mean, I think substantively, you have provided a really more positive kind of way forward, even in terms of how do we counter some of these real issues which are occurring in the professions, the multiple scandals that we find and so on, to provide kind of shock troops, you know, in the middle tier of society, really, you know, who, and sometimes the top tier as well, who, you know, could make an even greater contribution to the positive working of the world, and in the interim, you know, the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. So thank you again for that. And thank you for staying awake as well. That's much appreciated. Because what we're going to do now, we're going to turn to the other end of the time zone, because we're going to link up with Tracy Adams, who is actually has just finished her breakfast very early in the morning in Ontario. And it's really a delight to welcome Tracy, who is Professor of Sociology in the Department of Sociology at Western University, otherwise known as the University of Western Ontario in Canada. And she was previously head of that department. And I was really delighted to see that she's followed in my footsteps as president of the International Sociological Association a group, a research committee on professional groups. So good luck. And is also heavily involved in the Journal of Professions and Organisation on the editorial board, which is really nice. And she works really very much around the sociology of work, occupations and professions, dealing with, on the one hand, social inequality and the processes of professionalization, particularly in a Canadian, but also in a more global context. And writes some absolutely fascinating stuff. I love her work. And we really will find Tracy again will have another take on this issue, which is really refreshing, you know, to get multiple opinions. We're also already getting a lot of stuff through on the chat function, a lot of interesting questions, which hopefully we'll have time to answer and address at the end. So, Tracy, over to you.
Okay, well, thanks very much. Thank you, Mike and Unitar, and for the invitation to be here. And I'm very happy to be on the panel, and have listened to my colleagues with interest. I think they've made many excellent points, and I look forward to weighing in on some of my own thoughts on these issues. If I could have my slides up, yeah, and we'll just jump to the second one. So thank you. So on this screen, you will see Dr. Cowan. So he was a dentist in 19th century Toronto. And this is just a picture of him in his office. He's wearing a very nice suit and has all his 19th century equipment with him. Now, when Dr. Cowan was practicing again in the 19th century in Toronto, there really was an expectation that the dentists and other professionals would be leaders in their communities, in their professions, But they were independent practitioners. I think Dr. Cowan here is probably practicing out of his family home. And he's an independent man, and he is expected to independently contribute to his community. Opportunities for leadership amongst professionals today look really different because the sort of stereotypical 19th century, at least in Canada, professional was often self-employed or employed in a very small firm that was really run on a very collegial basis, as David was emphasizing, right, that collegiality aspect to it. But now a lot of professionals, even in professions like dentistry, where there still is a fair amount of self-employment, but more and more the professionals are employed, and they're employed in corporations, and they're employed in larger organizations where their main responsibility is to follow the instructions of other people. And we've also seen a change in professionals, their work situation. Their work is increasingly more precarious, or at the very least more uncertain, because there is so much change going on in terms of corporate and management structures, management philosophies, changing technology, changing healthcare demands. We've had a lot, of course, churning and uncertainty in the healthcare sector, increasing amount of shortages. And this just leads to a fair amount of uncertainty for professional workers. And when you're in a position of uncertainty, and when you're in a position of employment, there is a lot of pressure on professionals, especially sort of rank and file professionals, to just not really rock the boat, to not speak up if there's a problem, and really just to keep their heads down and follow orders. And as Daniel has explained, this does create opportunities for misconduct. And from what we've seen, there's even evidence of professionals being encouraged to commit misconduct. I'm currently in the field interviewing health professionals about the changing nature of work and how that's impacting their ethical responsibilities. I've previously done work with engineers, and I've had numerous people tell me repeatedly about their bosses encouraging them to cut corners, to charge for things, to give treatment that's not needed, just to boost a bill, to not do a thorough job with their work, to meet a deadline. So there is increasingly amount of pressure on professionals towards misconduct, and this creates a challenge for responsible leadership. Next slide, please. So I think professionals, like a lot of workers, maybe represent this worker in the cartoon here, where there are deadlines. There are, time constraints. There's a lot of administrative work. They're needing to be creative. There's people yelling at them, whether that's clients, colleagues, or bosses. They're under a fair amount of pressure, right? So part of it is an issue of an environment, right? And I think, again, like my colleagues, I see an opportunity here perhaps for some regulatory change. Professionals are really under a fair amount of scrutiny. They are kept accountable for their actions, and they can be held accountable when things go wrong. Some of the times the workplaces that they're working in aren't subject to the same kinds of constraints. And so while professionals are asked to abide by their ethics or push back when they see wrongdoing, again, if you're concerned that you're going to lose your job, if you do speak up, there may be an area you may not have as much ability to speak up. So there may be opportunities to hold organizations more accountable for the decisions that happen within them, and to subject these environments to scrutiny. There may be more we can do to encourage whistleblowing, to help people speak out when they see wrongdoing in their firms. A lot of the regulations I'm aware of encourage professionals to speak out against colleagues, but speaking out against bosses or clients that may be putting pressure on them. Again, maybe there's more we could do there. And there may be space for organizational industrial changes. When I interview engineers, they often talked about the triangle, the need to balance time, money, and quality as being so central to their work and the work of other professionals. And what the engineers told me was that that triangle is unbalanced because the organizations that they're working for are prioritizing money and to some extent time, because time is money. And what that means is that they aren't given always the time that they need to ensure that the services they put forward or they provide or the products they're providing are sufficiently safe, and that all the checks and balances have been put into place and processed. And of course, you know, when we see major engineering failures, when we see medical errors, often it comes down to people rushing or people sort of cutting a corner to save some time. And often that means that there's a whole bunch more money and time that might be spent on something later. So maybe if we can rebalance that triangle a little bit and have a bit of a balance between time and money, because right now it seems to be a little bit out of whack. Next slide, please. I think there's also changes that we can make to professional cultures and professional education. Professional students, when they're in school, they are trained to handle ethical challenges. I'm not sure how much training towards responsible leadership they get, but I think certainly there's more that training can do to help bolster leadership ability and to you know, foster those leadership skills when people go into practice. Again, when I do interviews with healthcare workers in particular, they say that the training for ethical challenges that they get when they're in school isn't necessarily helpful for them because they don't have the practice experience and maturity to really understand the issues and to really kind of work through the problems in a serious way. And so they've really told me that there really is a need for continuing education in this area, that this is just sort of a lifelong learning for professionals, and that they need the supports, they need the mentorship, they need, you know, leadership, I suppose, as well, to really help them navigate situations when they're in practice, and that they have some maturity and experience. So I think changing continuing education is really a good area for us moving forward. And I think that there is more that we can do to promote professional cultures that encourage leadership, especially in the face of organizational and societal pressures, because we know that those are many. Those are going to continue, given, again, rapid pace of technological change, shortages in healthcare, economic considerations, organizational pressures. These pressures are going to continue. So if we promote professional cultures that encourage leadership, we may be in a better place moving forward to foster professional leadership opportunities despite the changing context in which professionals are working. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Tracy. Very important presentation because like with Daniel's initial keynote, I think what you've highlighted is some of the structural pressures on professions. They don't exist as an island. They're actually part of organizations, part of the wider society, and are therefore influenced by that. And so if we're looking for a more positive future, we need to take that wider, more holistic view. And there were elements of your presentation. I also went back to what might be called as a thorny old chestnut about deprofessionalization, you know, given some of the changing conditions in which professions are operating in trying to exercise responsible leadership. So thank you very much for that. And we turn, last but not least, because I'm a great fan of Professor Kevin Light's work, you know, and I know that Kevin is even earlier than you in terms of his societal milieu in Illinois. What I'd like to say about Kevin is that he has inspired me in terms of looking at the changing roles that professions might play, and I'm hoping he's going to say a little bit about that in a new sort of world, that we're entering with changes, because we can't sort of go back to your dentist, Tracy, in operating as a solo practitioner in independent practice. We moved on from there from the 19th century. So, but Kevin, just to say a little bit about his background, is a professor, full professor, and former head of the sociology department at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and in the United States. He's edited a number of social science journals and also is a key member, like myself, of the Journal of Professions and Organization in terms of the editorial team, and has written extensively on work-related issues related to economic development, globalization, political sociology, always stimulating, had a lot of support from the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health, and the Ford Foundation for his work, which has been high-flown, and has also himself written a book on professional work, which is obviously, meat and drink to us in terms of this webinar. And I'm just so delighted that he's put the alarm clock on to get up a little bit earlier to strut his stuff today. So thank you, Kevin. Over to you.
Yes, thank you. It's great to be here. Sarah, if you could call up my slides and just go straight to slide number 2. I'm going to talk for a minute or two about a little bit different issue that I think the professions face and why they face it. I think part of what has happened as a result of the globalization of professions that Dan has talked about, and for sure in very dramatic fashion, and the spread of media fragmentation in addition to that, and some other things I'll talk about here in a minute, is that the public's relationship to professions has changed quite a bit just really in the last 20 years. So the public is getting information from all over the place. There is a lot of post-truth reasoning, as they call it, knowledge silos, what a Durkheimian sociologist would call knowledge normlessness or anomie, which if you're not in sociology, you don't have to know anything about. Some members of the political class increasingly play into this. So there are, in virtually every democracy you can name, there is a nationalist populist movement, and the national populist movement directs a lot of its ire toward experts and professionals. The professionals are not like us. They're cosmopolitan, they're unrooted, they have different values, they come from different places, and they're imposing these values on you. And by George, I am here to stop it. And whoever they are. So you name the democracy, these go under different names. Some are populist, some are nationalists. There's often quite a bit of overlap in what they argue for. So please go to slide 3. So we do have a global labor market for professionals, and so part of what has happened from a practical on the ground standpoint is that the deliverance of professional services to citizens is often conducted by people that are not from the place the citizen is. And so not only are there these big public scandals that Dan talks about, which are quite serious and real, and are tied to globalization and looking for different markets. But gee, the doctor I see is from the other side of the world. The person who's doing my taxes is from the other side of the world. The government bureaucracy hired to enforce the rules about my rubbish or something like that, they're from the other side of the world. I'm being controlled by people from the other side of the world. Now it's not strictly true, but you could sort of see how this would develop. But there are some other contextual issues as well that I think are important to realize as we talk about this. So the world is becoming much more complex, and there are a lot of what Ulrich Beck and others called managed risks. And managed risks are big societal level or national level decisions that people have to come to that have trade-offs. And so professions are increasingly drawn into discussions about these wicked problems and these trade-offs. And almost all of the decisions have trade-offs, and they have some uncertainty attached to them. So the consequences of professions being wrong or of the wrong decision being made are much bigger. So it's not merely if the surgeon makes the wrong decision, our grandmother will die. It's if we don't fight the pandemic in a certain way, hundreds of thousands or millions of people will die. If this financial decision is wrong, billions of dollars will be lost. Decisions of that sort. If we don't do something about global warming, then our coasts will be flooded or something like that. So this makes the consequences of ethical lapses look much bigger too. So the other thing is, because these problems are so complicated, if the public doesn't understand what the professions are trying to do, then that knowledge gap is filled by what other information flows into the system, which could come from anywhere and talk about anything. So in fact, the root issue with fighting a lot of, say, societal level problems is simply denial that the problem exists. That simply isn't there. So the globe is not warming. There's nothing wrong with our healthcare system here or someplace else. So there are big problems that are much more complicated, where the answers are less certain, and there's less trust in the professions as well. So and to some extent, that trust has to be rebuilt somehow, and that's really what slide 4 talks about. So go to slide 4. So at some level, one of the things we have to do, in addition to sort of engaging in regulatory action at the top, is we have to re-embed professions back in local communities a little bit, so that everyday people in many parts of the world see a professional doing their work, perhaps see somebody who's local, or who identifies closely with being local and who's embedded in the local community, actually competently performing the job and doing, following the ethical precepts that we're all talking about. And that's really, I think, the second part of this whole solution. So we not only need this sort of global control and better regulation of what professions do, so there's no regulatory shopping, there are fewer conflicts of interest, but then we also need a public faith, a recommitment to the public face of professions, where there's a lot of community engagement and outreach, and there are also locals who get involved in professional work itself. And with that, I think you'll start to see some changes about how professions are thought about. In many parts of the world, and including parts of the United States, unfortunately, people have grave suspicions about many of the professions, and there's nobody that practices that profession anywhere close to where they live. So if you have to go to a major city that's, several hundred kilometers away just to see a doctor, and then the doctor you see isn't from your local community or anywhere even close, that breeds still more suspicion. So my argument, I think, is there is both a regulation problem and then a cultural problem as well. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. As always, very wise words, and I particularly picked out there the issue of scaling up. That actually, we're dealing with, and this is particularly relevant to a UN context, we're dealing with global issues, climate change, massive issue with COVID, and, potentially other pandemics on the horizon. This isn't just a question of, as you said, the grandma dying on the operating table. It's much more global. And I think you provided some pointers as to where we might go to the future. So thank you so much for that. And we have about 10 minutes left. And what I would like to do, I would just say to Sarah, who's coordinating this, I have been monitoring the questions during the sessions. And it is actually interesting that some of them have been very directly addressed, such as the issue that what traits will help to make professions more responsible leaders. That has been quite a key issue for all the panelists and for Daniel and so on. And there has been quite a lively discussion about what happens if human rights are violated. And obviously, this is also very integral to the consequences of the action of professions. I mean, hopefully they will support human rights, but there can be situations where they don't do that. And there have also been other questions about how important are changes in society to the way that professions may behave in the future. And, Kevin has spoken about this actually in some of his work, which, as I say, I particularly like, which is about professions now becoming interpreters of information, with global access to the internet, and a lot of fake news and things like that. This is just one aspect of the way in which professions may need to adjust to the new world that we have. But, without me saying anything more, I think I'd just like to throw back in the first instance, and maybe for very quick comments from each of the panelists, to two of the other questions that have come up, which I think might require a specific response. One is, how far should governments be involved more in the oversight of professions? Clearly, we've seen a trend for greater state involvement. And the other one is, are professional ideals any less well implemented than they were in the past? Has there been some sort of slippage so that professionals are maybe less versed in applying ethical standards to the work they've got? So I just ask those two, and if you were able to address that globally in terms of global north, global south, that would be really really interesting. So Daniel, do you have a response to that?
Yes, I'll try and be quick. Yes, more government oversight, but it has to be also different, because one of the issues is they're not seen across boundaries. And obviously, you see in Parmalat where professional firms in Italy and France did not communicate, although they were connected in the same chain of expertise. So I think if there can be transnational regulation via the EU, WTO, UN. So I think we need to think about regulation at the super state level. We also need to think about regulation through standards, soft forms of regulation, which are very, very effective. Such as various standards that firms apply, and these can be provided by transnational organizations. There has been some positive movement. For instance, one of them has been separating the trade union from the regulatory function of professions. You see many examples of that in the UK, for instance. So sometimes different regulators have been created to look at the disciplinary side rather than the advocacy side of the profession. And I think we've also made some progress in terms of entity regulation. So if things go wrong, when is it the fault of an individual lawyer? And when is it the fault of the culture of the law firm, for instance, or of an accountancy firm? And entity-based regulation is also particularly important. But I think we need more. We need more joined-up regulation, particularly looking at the boundaries between professions, between nations. Mike, do you want me to take on the second question as well? Yeah. Okay. So the second one, it's difficult to say empirically, and it's difficult to have conclusive evidence, because it could be that things are reported more. But definitely there is a sense in the literature that standards have been slipping. And I think this has generally been connected to the emergence of a commercial logic. So some people talk about the commercial logic displacing a professional logic. Some people, like Stephen Brint, talks about the move between from a social trusteeship understanding of what a profession is to a technical understanding. So professionals view themselves as technical problem solvers who add value to the clients. They used to view themselves as gatekeepers of core skills which benefited society. Now, it's difficult to have had empirical evidence, but there is definitely a sense in the literature that standards have slipped, particularly because of this move towards narrow technical expertise and towards commercial motivations, and also towards growing complexity, much more confused, complex world, complex work, which then lends itself to mistakes and also misconduct. So I would say yes, with that caveat. It's difficult to have hard evidence, and perhaps things have been talked more about rather than happening more. I'll stop there.
Yeah, no, thanks very much, Daniel. That's really useful, adding another perspective. And of course, the whole world is more complicated with professional service firms, internationally, which in a sense, there are major gaps in terms of how far they are regulated in a global context. But if we just go to David, do you want to comment? I mean, we've had a very lively discussion on the Q&A, and some questions have come up about all about whistleblowing and professions and things like that. But without sort of loading this on your shoulders, perhaps a couple of lines, David, just on your reflections on these issues.
Right. I'm going to add an idea that hasn't been raised and that can be linked to some of these questions. That is that what we're seeing in our knowledge-intensive society is many professional projects where you have occupations, that are either new or perhaps traditional, be they nurses, be they high-tech people, IT people, emergency workers seeking professional status. And at the same time, the more traditional professions, as Daniel implies, perhaps, you're not always holding up professional status. So perhaps sort of governments and other regulatory agencies, transnational organizations can say, listen, so we have a world here where, people want professional status. Some aspire to it, others have it bestowed upon them and perhaps not keeping the standards. Perhaps we need sort of an overall set of standards that says to those that aspire to those groups and occupations that aspire to professional status, that yes, we can help you with that. We have sets of rules, of norms for how professionals behave, and at the same time, you guys, the traditional professions, the lawyers, the doctors, the accountants, and the academics as well, you guys too have to be in the same world where we're going to have professional status along with the important values of collegiality and trustworthiness and partnership for all, including the new and the existing professions. So perhaps those are some ideas that can hold things together.
Yeah, that's really helpful, David, adding another sort of dimension to the discussion. I am going to turn quickly to Tracy, if you have any quick comments on what has been said.
Yeah, just a few quick things to add. I mean, in terms of the regulation side, I think the regulation that we have in many countries is focused on catching those bad apples. And therefore, it's not as effective, as Daniel was saying, in dealing with the boundary issues, or I guess what, for lack of a better term, I'll call the bad bosses issue that I raised. And so I think it's more of a shift rather than maybe like an amount in some ways, or just a shift in how it's done. And then in terms of how professional ideals can be implemented, I do say in my talk, I talked about like the uncertainty of the employment situation being something that might limit that implementation. And one thing I didn't talk about that's come up a lot in my interviews is technology, which sort of now is kind of standardizing the practitioner customer interface in a way that I think makes it harder to bring that personal touch or implement those ideals, because the technology is kind of tried to formalize and standardize that interaction. And sometimes that isn't very good for customer service and building those ideals.
Yeah, no, that's good, Tracy. And I think we have learned a lot of good things and other other aspects from the COVID situation, you know, where we now have more pervasive kind of video interviews and discussions, you know, lawyers and clients and doctors and patients and so on, which can be very positive, but it also has another side, which is that we worry about, you know, is there a sufficient investigation, say in medicine, you know, as opposed to a face-to-face consultation and so on. But on the other hand, it makes some of the services more cost-effective. Kevin, I'm going to go over to you and see again if you have a minute or so, you know, line on this.
So I wanted to talk about slippage for 30 seconds, and I think part of the reason where there's been some ethical slippage in standards has been kind of through the back door, and the reason it's been through the back door is because the customers with the biggest wallets are determining what problems will be solved. So there are a lot of sort of problems that professions could address that don't have powerful or paying customers attached to them. And so increasingly, the ethos of the profession is oriented toward what other elites define as problems, and those may not be the problems professions should really be addressing these days.
Yeah.
So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Kevin. And I mean, it's been a fascinating discussion, very stimulating, and we've seen a sort of multifaceted approach to dealing with the issue of professions and responsible leadership, which is actually much more pivotal to where we're going than people realize. It's fundamental. They're key actors, and they're not talked about enough in terms of where we're situated in a global context. But I would at this point like to thank very much our hosts at UNITAR, particularly Sarah Bonsharif, Daniel Nazarov, who's also been helping to set up and publicize this event, as well, of course, to Alex Meyer, who's made a very good start for the discussion. And of course, to thank my colleagues and friends on the editorial board and the editorial function at the Journal of Professions and Organization, who participated, including our guest speaker, Professor Daniel Mutia, and our panelists, Professors David Brock, Tracy Adams, and Kevin Leicht. And we really have had some really interesting Q&A questions, which we've endeavored to encompass as sufficient as time will allow. I hope that everyone has enjoyed this discussion, and that participants in the audience and also our panelists and speaker will return for future webinars in terms of the UNITAR IRL series. I would just make one plug at the end of this session, which is to say that we do have the UNITAR collaborative book, which is on responsible leadership, essential to the achievement of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which has a very interesting chapter on professions, which I wrote, which you might be interested in looking at. It's very reasonably priced at $29.95 and in paperback. And I think that as a collaborative volume between UNITAR and IRL, it's a must-read. And I would, on that note, say thank you very much again to everyone who's been involved. and to wish you well for the rest of the day, and looking forward to welcoming you back again soon.
Thanks to you, Mike. All the best. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.